anywhere near what it was yesterday in any way, shape, or form for most of our life, for most of the way we think about living. We're going to have to get used to this sort of new normal. I think that's something that we're going to need to embrace. You'll know, if you know much about the idea of change management, you can sort of see our entire country following the process of change management and this whole idea of denial, of mourning, of negotiating, and then finally to acceptance. And we're pretty long ways still from probably the acceptance of this reality that we're in and the new world we're in. And that's where you see these fits and starts as we sort of go through what they call the valley of change. We're clearly going through this valley now. You know, it's completely changed the whole global landscape in terms of the way we would even imagine what the future might look like. I'm a strategic planning person. That's my sort of role here at Purdue, and I've been doing strategic planning with agribusiness companies for 20-something years now. And one of the things that I try to get people to understand more than anything else is that strategy is really more about being prepared for the possibilities of what might happen in the future rather than trying to say this is what the future will be. Right? It's one of the reasons why I've not signed up very often to do the hard job that Ed has, which is to try to tell you what corn price is going to be at harvest in October. I don't have a clue what that price of corn is going to be, right? So I've just given up on the whole idea of trying to guess at what that particular price might be. We know right now mostly we're about survival, but we also need to be thinking, well, okay, but after we get past this survival piece, what does the day after look like? What's that new normal going to be? I like to think about what that new normal is by thinking about drivers of change. What are the drivers that will be changing the way the world happens around us? And that's part of what I want to talk with you about today is what I see as these big, broad drivers. So this won't be just agriculture oriented. This is sort of what's happening in our society. And I want us to think together a little bit. Well, what would that mean for us with respect to what we might be thinking about for the future in agriculture, right? So that's a little bit about what we'll talk about. Now, to start with, I want to just say, let's take a big, broad view of the world and recognize that nobody in the world has any clue what's going to happen for the future. If you look at any organization right now, what they're doing is giving you scenarios of what the possibilities might be. That's the kind of uncertainty we face. On the right-hand side, you can't see the slide very well. That's fine. I'm not interested in the details there, but that's McKinsey and Company. They've done a really nice job, I think, of thinking about potential scenarios. There, they've drawn up 9 potential scenarios, which tells you the folks that are supposed to be smart people, get paid all kinds of money at McKinsey, don't even have any idea what the world's going to be. One of 9 possible futures, right? On the left, I have the WTO forecasts of GDP for the world in terms of what they think that recovery might look like. And they have 3 types of possible recoveries: a V-shaped GDP variation, a U-shaped GDP variation, and an L-shaped GDP variation. Now, the V-shaped is sort of this idea that we're going to, the world, so this is really global, but the world is going to see a steep drop quickly and then this relatively steep recovery. And you see that in their numbers. What they mean by steep drop, they say almost a 5% drop in economic activity in the year 2020. And over the year 2021, we'd see a 4.2% increase in the economy. So effectively, by the time you get to the end of 2021, we're back where we were end of 2019. That's the V-shaped variation that WTO says is a potential scenario. Then they have their U-shaped scenario, which is actually a much deeper, much longer time period in terms of what happens to us there. It's a 9% drop in GDP over the full year of 2020, which we still have half of it to go. And then in 2021, we see an 8.1% increase, but then we're still not anywhere close to being back to, let's say, the time period of 2019 with respect to global GDP. We're still looking at 2022 probably before we get back. And then finally, you have the L-shaped, which is the really bad, really long recovery period, which says we're going to lose 11% of our GDP throughout the whole time period of 2022 or 2020. 2021, we'd only see a really slow recovery, 2.8% increase in GDP by 2021. That would result in probably looking at 2025 maybe before we got back to a 2019 sort of level of GDP in the world. So this is all over the board, right? From we know it's bad now, and we know it's not getting better very quickly at the moment. But you know, we're talking about into 2021, into 2022, or maybe into 2025 before we completely recover from this GDP, which gives you some sense of what those possible scenarios might be. And so one of the things that I wanted to try to do today was engage you in the audience a little bit as we go through this Zoom presentation. And I think Rachel is going to be able to help me here. She's going to put up a poll for you right now based on this idea of V-shaped, U-shaped, and L-shaped. I just want, from your perspective, for you to tell me which one of these do you believe is most likely to be the scenario that we're going to be facing over this next 12 to 24 months.
I'm smiling because I can see the results coming in real time.
Yeah, you're keeping them secret, though. I can't see them at all. I have no idea what's happening.
I will share the results for you as soon as
we've got. It's going to be a surprise for all of us.
Yeah. Got about 65% of the viewers have selected an option. If you haven't selected yet, please do so. If you're not brave enough, that's fine too. I'll cut it off here in just a second.
I was going to say, Rachel, it sounds like about half the audience knows what it's going to be, so they went ahead and voted.
I've got 70% of the viewers have voted. You want me to call it there?
Yeah, let's call it there and just see what they're thinking. All right, so, well, as you might expect, it's all over the board, just like the WTO is. Who knows which one it's going to be. Slightly more for the U-shaped GDP variation. I'm guessing that that's the sort of safer vote, if you will. That's the way I probably would have voted too, is to say I just don't see this likely being a V-shaped recovery. L-shaped seems awful doom and gloom, and I think we're in an environment where we'd like to think we're a bit more optimistic, but 24% of you even think L-shaped might be it, and I think that's an important caveat to keep in mind, is that it's not a completely unrealistic scenario where people say, oh, that's never going to happen. I mean, we got the full 25% of the group here who thinks that might be where we're headed, this long, slow slog of a recovery. Like I said before, I don't know which one it's going to be, but I think we would behoove ourselves to be preparing for all three of those possibilities to be there. And that's not an easy thing to do. How do you prepare your farm business, your agribusiness, to manage through these different types of possibilities for what we're going to be doing with respect to recovery from this pandemic? So thanks for voting with me, and I'll ask you to do this again here in just a little bit. So let me do my best version of Ed. I'm not going to tell you what the prices are going to be in any way, shape, or form. This is sort of my longer term view of where I think ag markets are. We've seen some massive demand shocks with this pandemic, and really, if I were being honest with my good constituents in the corn and soybean markets, you ain't seen nothing. And if you grow lettuce, that's where you've really seen market shifts, right? You've seen 80% of your demand go away in 2 weeks. You've seen 80% of your demand come back 3 weeks later. I mean, it's a dramatic thing across the system to see the kinds of shocks we've seen. And of course, we've seen them. I don't want to make light of what we've seen in our own markets here in Indiana with corn and soybeans, but with also the other crops that we grow here in the state of Indiana and our livestock markets as well. There have been lots and lots of shocks. And I think they're going to continue to see these kinds of shocks happening over the next couple of years. My view of it is that this sort of fits and starts that we're seeing right now and how we're trying to open up our economy, and then the virus flares back up again, and now maybe we're slowing it down. Those things are not going to go away overnight. We're going to see this sort of fits and starts as we learn how to live with a virus that's very clearly a year-long virus. It's not a seasonal virus. It's going to be here. It's going to be a part of what we're doing, and it's likely to be with us for a while. So we're going to see these flare-ups, these shocks, these things happen to the system, and we're going to have to be kind of aware of the fact we're going to see these sort of volatility pieces. You know, the other thing is, and this was happening really before we even got here, we've got clearly growing global ending stock levels. We have these lower prices and tighter margins. Those things were happening before we got to COVID. They're just being exacerbated by what we see with this pandemic, right? If we try to get to some sort of a more optimistic price scenario, it needs a quick V-shaped global economic recovery. And if we can't get that sort of substantial increase in demand to happen quickly, it's going to take some time to work off all of these stocks, right? Or we're going to need some sort of weather production shortfall, which, as Ed and I talked about before we got on here, right now we're probably too late for any sort of weather event in most of the U.S. now. We're probably made most of the crop. There's still some places where that would happen. And of course, what we'd really like to happen is for that to happen to Brazil or some other place, not to us in the process, right? But basically, we're hoping for ill on somebody else to basically get any sort of improvements. Fourth thing I'd tell you is that from an overall farm income perspective, the pandemic is going to have a strong negative impact. I don't know how it can't. I mean, I don't want to be doom and gloom, but look, we're not going back to 100% of the activity that we saw at the end of 2019 with people driving their cars and using gasoline. So ethanol is coming back from where it was, but it was in a really bad spot, and it's not in a great spot now. And to think that we're going to have gasoline demand suddenly going back to where it was in 2019, and now we're using all that ethanol, that just seems pretty unrealistic to me that that's going to happen anytime in the near short term or short run. So those sorts of things are going to have really negative impacts on farm income, not to mention the fact that we're going to continue in the fruit and vegetables side of the industry. Our meat side of our industry is going to struggle with the fact that restaurants being slow in demand means that our higher premium, higher priced products and livestock are going to struggle. So those are all negative impacts from the pandemic on farm income. Fifth thing I would say is maybe the one piece of good news, if you want to look at it as good news, is that production costs are likely to decrease. Right? Fertilizer costs are going to they were already lower this year than we might have expected. They're likely to be lower again next year. So we're going to see some production cost reduction. Certainly anything fuel related is going to be cheaper, highly likely to be cheaper moving forward. And then government payments are probably going to increase from the baseline. You know, one of the things that in our divided country with respect to its politics, one of the things that still seems to hold on with respect to across the aisle agreement often is supporting farmers with respect to government support activities. Whether we got Republicans in control or Democrats in control, they tend to move towards saying, okay, the government needs to step in when the farmer is in need. Now, you know, it might be a little bit different view of it or how they go about it or what they do with it, but history tells us that regardless of whether it's Republicans or Democrats, generally speaking, when we're in trouble, government tends to step up, and I think they'll continue to here as well. Now, I say good or bad, depending on how you want to look at that. I think most of us would say we'd rather farm the markets than farm the government, but this may be the place that we are for now. And I think that has some implications for us that I'll talk about here in a few minutes. Finally, this one last thing I'd say about the ag markets is that while we're in this kind of a situation, interest rates are low. Ed, you told us how we could see oil be negative. I would not be too surprised if we continue to see these kind of tough pressures here if we don't end up with some negative interest rates. We've seen that a little bit happen in Europe. We've never seen that here in the U.S., but it's possible here in the U.S. if we continue to struggle, particularly with this second pandemic, this second flare-up here. If we start to shut things down again, we might very well see some monetary policy that moves us towards the concepts of negative interest rates. So from that perspective, money is available relatively cheaply. For those farms that can maintain some financial position, lenders have money. They have cash. They have the ability to loan, and they will. So I don't see it as a credit crunch for those farms that are credit worthy. Now, the problem is how many farms we're going to have that are no longer credit worthy could be a challenge, and you're not going to get money from banks if you're not credit worthy. But those that are credit worthy, I don't see the U.S. facing a situation where we're not going to be able to get the financial credit that we need in order to continue to perform, and it's going to be at relatively low interest rates. So as we think about strategies from a farm perspective, to the extent that your farm is one that's in strong financial position, there are opportunities here, probably with cheap money available, that you might want to think about how you would leverage those opportunities. So I want to move from those ag markets where I told you I'm not good at predicting those, but those are sort of broad drivers of change. They're a bit negative in the sense that they suggest that we're going to be in a pretty tough commodities market. My view of that in general, just for the context of argument here, where we may have some disagreements, is that I don't believe that COVID was necessarily the reason for this. I think we were headed there anyway. I think we've been headed there for probably the last 4 years. We've had some interesting shocks that have happened along the way that have kind of hidden this sort of slow creep up in continued increases in our stocks. That when you get a weather shock like we had 2 years ago, you would think that with that kind of planting disaster that we had, that we'd be in really high prices right now and really short on supplies. And the answer is we came through a terrible weather shock and still have stocks. We came through a year before with terrible river floods and big big start to our war with China, and still had large stocks and large stuff available to us. And so I just feel like that we've been on a pattern here for 3 or 4 years of building stocks. Now suddenly we've got this tremendous drop in demand, and that tremendous drop in demand only exacerbates the problem of building our stocks. And those are things that we're going to have to find a way to work through. So that's the reason why ultimately I'm a bit bearish, I suppose, in terms of where I see us going in these long-term markets if we don't get some sort of big shock. So let me talk to you about some longer-term drivers of change then. So these are really sort of, and I did this on purpose right now. Maybe I did this on purpose, to be honest with you, to say, because since I don't know what really is going to happen in the world, then maybe what I should do is get stuff that's broad enough that nobody will be able to argue about it. And that way I can just talk about those things. For those of you who know me and my career here at Purdue know that I'm very close with Mike Golgi, been close with him all my life, all of my career here at Purdue. And one of the things that he taught me to do a long time ago is to have these sort of visions of what the future might look like and talk to audience about those things that are far enough in the future nobody can argue about them, because by the time they either come to fruition or don't, I'll probably be dead, so it won't matter, right? I don't know about that in this case. These are probably shorter run than the end of my life, and so you may be able to tell me I'm wrong when this is over with. But these are sort of 8 drivers that I think are really important for us to think about the broader implications that these things have for our markets and for our businesses. First is deglobalization. I'll talk about each one of these in detail, but deglobalization I think is really important. We've got this discussion now about resilience versus efficiency, and a lot of pressure in the marketplace to think about this resilience versus efficiency issue. We'll talk about that as well. We're moving to a contact-free economy, and I think that has a lot of implications for the way we interact in our businesses as well as in our society. We're not headed for more government intervention. We absolutely, clearly, with no arguments, have more government intervention, and I think that has some real implications for us moving forward. We've got clearly more business scrutiny. Society is looking at business and what we do in business, what we do in capitalistic societies like we have here, our capitalistic businesses, they're looking at us with more scrutiny. We're seeing, I think, the beginnings of some pretty big industry structure shifts, much of that driven by COVID and this pandemic, and showing us where maybe some of the weaknesses are in the structures that we have now. I'm not sure it's showing us what the answers are for those weaknesses, but it's showing us where they are. We have an employment issue in the U.S. for sure, and a number of different things that I think are important with respect to employment, including some issues around social issues that I think we need to deal with, and then also as it relates to immigration policies, we need to think a little bit about what the implications of these employment shifts might be. And my 8th one is on purpose, silver linings, because the first 7 are mostly going to depress us because they're about change, and nobody likes change, and we don't want change, and these things are about change. The silver linings is sort of a optimistic view of how we kind of manage through this pandemic world. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. So let me take each one of these in turn and talk to you a little bit about what I see there. So deglobalization, look, it's not new. The 90s and the 2000s were all about global, global, global. We got to be more global. We're a global world. We're going to have a global society. We're going to have global economy. All of this is about global. And starting in the early, mid to 2010s, we really started to back away from that. right? And it's not just the U.S. Although the U.S. has been a part of this. We're not immune to this, but all around the world, we've seen a tremendous increase in protectionism. Some restrictive attitudes began to really appear. That's before the pandemic, but then the pandemic has made this even stronger for us, right? I mean, think about it. More than 3 billion live in countries whose borders are now totally closed to non-residents. There's 7 billion people on this planet. 3 billion of them live in countries where no non-residents can come into that country at all. Wow, that's pretty incredible. That was not even thought of a year ago, right? Data from the World Bank and Market Access Maps and Global Trade Alert as of late April indicated 17 countries have implemented a total of 40 policy constraints on ag exports, restricting their agricultural exports. Right? This is what people do. They get into a pandemic situation. They're fearful of their ability for their people to be able to eat, and they stop exporting to make sure that they have the food at home. Okay? You see this big move, and we saw this move again before the pandemic, but now we see it even more, local versus global. Right? How do we think more about local foods, for example? Right? And we'll talk more about that in detail. Now, what we've seen because of COVID, and you see this probably most prominently in the medical profession, where we really struggle with supplies and supply chains, right? And our reliance on global, cheap, efficient, historically effective supply chains to keep costs down and get supplies in. And I'm talking about the medical profession because that's where we saw the biggest hiccup to start with, but it happens in all of our industries, including right here in our own industry in agriculture. We've relied heavily on these relatively long global supply chains that are efficient, cheap, lower priced, right? And generally have been effective until now. Until now, they're not nearly as effective as they were. And we see that happening, and we see it most prominently in the medical profession, where we relied so much on PPE from foreign countries, making those things cheaply for us, that suddenly we couldn't get them, right? Well, that's making us think then, maybe we ought to have our supplies closer to home. Maybe we ought to think about having our suppliers closer to home. And so that's driving even more of this sort of deglobalization opinion that we see in the marketplace. The local food systems thing, just some interesting things that I think are happening. We see these trends happening. Again, local foods were something that we were talking about well before COVID came along. But now consumers are really thinking even more about this idea of local food systems, right? But why? Well, because we're in a situation in a pandemic where we're all local. And we're not traveling anywhere anymore. Everybody's local, and they're buying their food local. And sometimes they go to their local Kroger and there's not food available. They're thinking, hey, wait a minute, what do I got to do to make sure that I have food available, right? So there's some interesting characteristics about local. One is geographic proximity, fewer steps between the farm and the table, so we don't have to worry about what the disruptions are that happen in that short supply chain instead of these long supply chains we're used to, right? Smaller levels of production capacity mean that if we got a production capacity interruption in one place, it's a small amount, as opposed to what we'll talk about later in some other areas like the meat industry, where if you've got one company who produces 40% of the meat and they have a disruption, that's a big disruption because 40% is suddenly disrupted, as opposed to this sort of smaller production capacity where we spread that risk out. There's also this argument for keeping income circulating locally. As we're thinking about people are losing their jobs, okay, I think many of us have faced this sort of social pressure, if you will, to say, hey, if you can get out safely, go do business with your local small business because they need help to try to get through this pandemic, right? Don't go out and eat at the restaurant, or couldn't, now you can, but before that, go get takeout and bring it back home. Something to try to help local. This is the whole idea of we got to circulate our income locally. A lot of people are talking about. The shift from this idea of global food systems to local is alluding to this idea of potential to build in resilience, which is something I'll talk about next. The idea being that our supply chains will be more resilient if they're more local. Maybe. I don't think the research is out there that tells us that that will in fact be the case, that we're going to be more resilient just because we have a local system versus a global food system. But here's what I do know. Our scale and supply chain capacity was designed to capture efficiencies, for sure. All of our global food systems are built that way, to drive efficiencies. If we shift away from that, and we do shift more towards local supplying activity, costs will go up. And I think that we're not talking enough really about that. I'm not saying it should all be about efficiency and cost, because there are trade-offs in all of these things we do, but we need to understand that if we're going to shift from a globalized world to a deglobalized world, we're going to increase food costs at the margin. There are then people at the margin who won't be able to afford food. And that doesn't get talked about enough, is that trade-off that we have there in these processes. And I think we need to make sure we keep that in mind as we see this deglobalization continue. Deglobalization then is also related to this idea of resilience versus efficiency. A lot of discussion these days about are we really resilient? Is our food system resilient? Are our supply chains resilient to these kind of shocks? And first we ought to ask ourselves, well, what does the word resilience mean? That's the ability to absorb a shock and to come out of it better than the competition will be. It's the key to survival and sort of long-term prosperity. In fact, there's a level above resiliency that we call anti-fragile. And anti-fragile actually means that you absorb a shock, and when you come out of it, you're better than you were before. Resilience says, I come out of it better than my competition was. We both may be hurt, but I'm a little bit better off than my competition. I was able to survive, and they weren't. That's basically the idea of resilience. The idea of anti-fragile is that I take this opportunity, this shock, and I turn it into a positive to become even better when I come out of it, even better myself, right? And so I've been pushing people to think about what can we do to be anti-fragile? How can we take a terrible situation we're in and say, how do we do something to make ourselves even better when we come out of it? What we know from the research is that those resilient companies, those resilient businesses are the ones that usually bounce back much faster after a crisis. One of the keys to that resilience is preparation for the crisis, and specifically the ability to cut operating costs. And I should have put this on here because I think it's really important in farming. And that is a keen focus on productivity. So cutting operating costs without cutting productivity, those that have been able to do that well in production agriculture are the ones that are the most resilient to these sorts of markets and ability to move past them. So, and I'll talk about this more a little bit later, but if we put it in a nutshell, it's really about yields. It's really about the ability to maintain yields at the farm level when you cut costs, not cutting costs that actually hurt us in the end, right? I like to think of it as our ability to cut our costs per bushel, right? We can cut our costs and actually increase our costs per bushel. So we actually end up ineffective with that cost savings. A specific example I can give to somebody, it'd be easy, Ed, for us to save $100 an acre in corn production. Just don't put any nitrogen out. That would save you $100 per acre in cost, for sure, no doubt about it. But how bad would it hurt your yields? And in the end, your costs actually end up going up because your rent per bushel, because you'd have half the bushels, would suddenly be $3 a bushel for rent. You can't make it anymore, right? So these are things that we want to think about. Resilience is about this cost cutting and productivity combination that we need to put together. That's how I think we create resilience, and it's going to be critically important in these sort of shocks. You also might have to rethink the restructuring of your supply chains. How many of us in production agriculture have thought about what happens if next year our inputs are on allocation? This year, frankly, the pandemic hit our manufacturers of our products late in the season for them. So because of that, most of the product was already produced. But now we're going through some substantial disruptions in, let's say, places like Louisiana with respect to the disease. If they shut production plants down again, maybe we don't have full production of the crop protection products we're used to getting, and regions get put on allocation next year. Are we resilient as a farm to say, hey, we've got a challenge here where we might not have supplies available to us? Are we talking to our suppliers to make sure that they have plans in place to make sure they have product available? one of the things that I think is important for us to think about in our markets with respect to resilience is that, particularly in corn and soybeans, my judgment is this: the pandemic came late. Because it came late, what's happened to us hasn't been that impactful. It's next year. It's the next cycle that I think is going to be more impactful on us. And I think we should be thinking about this idea of rebalancing our priorities, making sure that we think about resiliency as being just important to our strategy as cost and efficiency are, right? And that's the other place that I think we're going to see some impacts with respect to resiliency. And I'm worried about this a little bit for us. Our input companies and our buyers of our products in production agriculture are thinking about this carefully right now, what to do about resilience versus efficiency. Resilience often looks in some cases like redundancies. That's actually going to increase costs. And so there's going to be this dynamic trade-off between how do we become more resilient and how do we manage efficiency. And in our marketplace, that's tough with margins already as tight as they are. What's going to happen to the ability to make those supply chains resilient, yet keep them efficient and lean, so that we don't have these increasing costs, these potentially increasing costs? I suspect the longer we face these sort of shocks in the marketplace and these disruptions to the businesses that provide services to us in production agriculture, the more they're going to move towards actions that actually increase their costs, but make them more resilient. And these are going to be trade-offs that are going to be difficult for us to manage. I'm going to skip that slide in the interest of time. Let's move on to the third driver, contact-free economy. And it's across all kinds of things. This is really kind of amazing to me to think about. First of all, digital commerce. We knew that already. It was coming. It's been coming for a while now, trending up for sure before the pandemic, but now it's just been exacerbated. This to me is a shocking statistic I want to share with you. It doesn't matter to us here in Indiana so much, but in Italy, why do I pick Italy? Italy is the oldest population on the planet. Italy's old, right? Italy's old. E-commerce transactions rose 81% since the end of February in Italy. Now, why do I say that? That's probably not fair of me, probably wrong. Over time, I've started to poke fun at old people a little bit more. Why? Because I'm one of them. I'm the old people, right? But generally speaking, the older populations are not as used to the technology and the use of technology, digital commerce. Those are not the kind of things we do. In Italy, the oldest population in the world, look what they've done with e-commerce. Just to give you an example, is e-commerce coming to us? Of course it is. My 89-year-old grandma now buys all of her groceries online. In February, she had no clue you could even do that. 89, she buys them all online. Amazing. And she loves it because it actually allows her to get out of the house. She buys her groceries online, but she doesn't have them delivered. She lives too far out in the countryside for that. But she gets to drive to town, and the store puts them in her car for her, so she doesn't have any contact with anybody, right? Contact-free economy, but she gets to get out and do something in the same time frame. So that's really pretty amazing. Look at what we're doing now in places where we thought we probably wouldn't have done it before. Telemedicine. You now go see your doctor online. I haven't done it yet, but here's what I will tell you. I could tell you a quick story about this. I'm supposed to be getting my teeth cleaned from my dentist. It's the schedule is coming up here, and I am not sure I want to do that yet. I haven't figured out whether or not that's something I actually want to do. I'm trying to see whether or not they can do this telemedicine thing with cleaning my teeth, but I have not yet been able to visualize exactly what the computer looks like that has hands that come out. I don't know. I'm probably overly worried about it, but for some reason, even though I know the lady personally, she's very nice. Just the idea of her spending an hour leaning over the top of me with her hands in my mouth while I'm breathing wide open just seems like maybe one of the places that could be a challenge. So I haven't been all that willing to do that yet. But so we got this telemedicine issue. The other thing that we see is automation, right? So, I mean, we're having so much disruption related to pandemics, and that pandemic is affecting people. And so the work that needs to get done that people are doing, companies now have even more incentive than they already did. Remember, McKinsey Global Institute's already said 60% of all jobs we're likely to see at least 30% of their tasks automated by 2030. Now they're actually saying That's probably going to happen by 2025 because there's just so much more pressure on the system now to be able to keep things moving ahead, and people are the disruptor. Pandemics make people into the disruptor, and that's a challenge for us. So this sort of contact-free economy where we start to see more and more and more stuff that's happening for us without people being involved in it, I think that's a trend that's here to stay, actually. We've learned how to do some of these things, and they're likely to stay with us. What does that mean for us in agriculture? A couple of things. One is, if I'm serving production agriculture, I got to realize that digital commerce is coming to the farm for sure. They're going to be buying online too. They already are, and they'll do more and more of it because they're capable of doing it. We've learned how to do that. We're getting better at it. And so I think that's going to continue to be there for us. I think the telemedicine thing is sort of the precursor to, we're going to have those agronomists, those specialists, those people that are providing us insights on what's happening on our farm. They're going to be doing that, not in person, not in the field. We're going to have our phone. We're going to show them what's happening in the crop. They're going to take a look at it, and they're going to say, this is what it looks like. Or they're going to have gone to the crop without us even knowing they were out there. They're going to come back, and we're going to have a Zoom meeting or some sort of meeting where we're talking about, here's what I see in the field, and here's what I think is going to happen. That's sort of contact-free activity is going to happen to us even at the farm level, I believe. And then, of course, automation. The more we do automation in other industries, the easier it is for that to be translated into agriculture. We're going to see more and more of that automation happening to us in agriculture, which is not new because we already knew that was coming. Fourth driver, more government intervention in the economy. I won't spend a lot of time on this one, but imagine, I do want you to think about this. As of April the 10th, governments across the globe had announced stimulus plans amounting to $10.6 trillion. That's about to be 11.6 trillion. Actually, it'll be more than that. 11.6 trillion if ours gets passed, because that's another trillion that we're thinking about passing. There's 3 trillion in the EU. So we're now talking about $15 trillion. Wow. Well, the 10.6 trillion in April 10th was the equivalent of 8 Marshall Plans. So imagine the Marshall Plan trying to get us out of the Great Depression, and we're spending 8 times that. 8 Marshall Plans. That's a tremendous amount of government money, government funding going out to try to help manage through this situation. My view of this is, as these interventions become more common, and they are becoming more common, the role of the state's materially going to affect the way business is conducted and the way our lives are conducted. Effectively, you can think of it this way. The more that the government decides to use the taxpayer dollars to send them out to citizens and to companies, the more they're going to expect, because their taxpayers are going to expect, because their voters are going to expect, that you should have some strings attached to that money. I think we can fully anticipate that's going to be the case. And agriculture is my slide on the left because it's very clear. We're as happy to reach out for the help as anybody else is right now. And we should recognize that as we do that, and I'm not saying it's not needed, it's not a judgment, but we need those things. And we've been doing it for 3 years now, since well before COVID even. Those government monies have been coming to agriculture. To think that those are going to come and not have strings attached to them, highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. So that probably means as we move, particularly if we were to have a change in administration at an election, more regulation, we're likely to see that regulation come back to us. Those are things that are likely to happen. And from a broad picture perspective, hey, handing out, asking for handouts with the left hand, and then hoping nobody pays attention to what we do with the right hand, let us do our own thing with it, seems like an unlikely thing to me. And we just want to make sure that we're paying attention to the fact that this is likely coming with strings attached. And that leads to my fifth driver, which is more business scrutiny overall, not just the government, but society as a whole. Rightly or wrongly, they're questioning the goals and objectives of capitalism. And while I know the audience I'm speaking to, and we don't have to like the fact that they're questioning that, but we have to understand that they are questioning it. The question is, what are the objectives of the future that they're going to be holding business to? And I can tell you that if we're going to have our government, our taxpayers sending money out citizens are going to start saying then people need to behave in a certain way. And it's happening, and we know it's happening, right? That they gave money to the banks, and then they told the banks, you're not doing any dividend payments. You're not doing any bonus payments. I mean, they're now telling them how to run their business, right? They're telling them how to run their business. And that's going to continue to happen. A couple of things that I point out to you. One is sustainability. I think sustainability is going to become an even more important issue coming out of COVID than it was. Why? Because we're recognizing what's happening to our planet, and it's not necessarily planet from an environmental perspective, although I'm going to tell you about that in a minute too, but it's about pandemics and how we are a globe. I mean, yes, this virus likely started in China. It's here in the US now. It doesn't matter where it came from. It's a global issue, right? Dealing with our overall planet and how things work together, society's going to have more expectations of how we work together as a planet on things like this. That's going to happen to us in business. We're going to be looked to say, what are you doing? How are you working together with these issues? People, certainly people have become a much more important issue. One, they're getting sick. Two, they're getting laid off. And three, we have people that we show are in different levels of the economy or in socioeconomic paths that are getting affected differently, right? What we've seen is that what we're seeing in this pandemic is that the social equity is not there. I mean, it's being pretty starkly pointed out to us. And that means more scrutiny on business to think about what they're doing besides just profit. And I'm not saying that we haven't been doing that, right? But we all have been thinking about sustainability and profit, people, and planet. And we've thought more and more about that as we've moved along. I know this Soybean Association has worked on these issues too. How do we make sure that we're actively engaged in the discussions about doing these things? So it's not that we're not doing them. What I'm suggesting to people is that the drivers are meaning that the weight is being moved more towards people and planet and even more away from profit. One of the reasons for that is look at the bottom picture. That's India. That's India, March 2019 on the left. That's India, March 2020 on the right. That's the air quality in India. The air quality difference. That's not an agriculture related issue. Agriculture didn't do that. One of the things that we can say in agriculture is that we can say, wow, look at all this clean air that's happening around the world, and farming's still going the same way it was going before we had COVID. There must be something else that causes all of this pollution problem. Yes, we can say that, and I think we can legitimately say something about that agriculture may not be the major contributor here. But what we can also recognize is that the society now sees what the potential is. And they're going to demand more of this, reaching this potential from every industry, including our own. And I think these are things that we want to keep in mind, that we're going to have more scrutiny on our businesses now for lots of different reasons. My sixth driver change is industry structure shifts. Imagine this. Look, so you can't see my chart very well on the right, and I'm not that interested in the detail. I'm interested in you sort of seeing the big picture of what's happening there. All right, so this is about food away from home and food at home. Right? Food at home and food away from home. We saw dramatic reductions in food away from home demand. This is not new news to you, except I put this chart here because you can't see it well, but this is back here on the left is 2008 through 2009. That was our Great Recession. I didn't want to do the Great Depression because it takes the chart too far back, but there's the Great Recession. And did we have food demand decreases? Yes, we did, in both food away from home and food at home. But about 5% maximum decreases month over month. Look out on the far right. We've never seen shocks like this in our system, ever. This is, now we're talking about, in April, we're talking about 60% reduction in food away from home expenditures. 60% reduction. That's incredible. Incredible. We saw a big spike then in food at home. So this is grocery store demand, a more than 20% increase in grocery store demand in March. Now in April, that came back down to just over 5% increase, which meant that sort of the stock up mentality happened. Now we're sort of in a maintenance activity. But here's what I think is most important about this. I have a hard time seeing us going back to the way it used to be with respect to food away from home. I see it for a couple reasons. One is for at least the short run period here through the end of the year and maybe into next year before we get vaccines, people are going to be skittish about going to restaurants, about eating out, about food away from home. They're going to be skittish about that from a health perspective. Two, from an income perspective, it's more expensive to eat out. So we're not going to have the same income we had. So that's still not going to bring it back. But I think even longer term, we need to think about this as an overall shift in demand. What? Consumers, many of them, of which never knew how to cook, now know how to cook. Consumers who didn't know that they could have really interesting conversations with their family at the dinner table, now understand that there's lots of things that can be learned at the dinner table. I'm telling you, they didn't know this before. Right? We're in our fast-growing, fast-moving society, and everybody's running like crazy. They're all eating out of a paper bag and maybe talking on their cell phone while they're eating out of a paper bag and driving with their knee, I guess. Right? Now we're not driving with our knee. We're not eating out of a paper bag, and we're not talking on our cell phones. We're at home cooking and having conversations at the table. That's a dramatic change in behavior that I have a hard time believing it's just going to suddenly go back the other way. I think we're going to keep some of that mentality there, which means we're not going to see the same dramatic recovery in food and overall food demand, because you'll notice the gray line that I have there is food demand overall. That's a almost 30% drop in food demand overall. A couple of reasons for that. One is obviously food away from home is a little more expensive because of service. That's certainly part of this. But another big reason for it, portions. So restaurant portions are always bigger, almost always bigger than they are at home. So as we stay away from restaurants, we eat more at home, portions are going to be down. So quantity is down. Second thing is restaurants, typically, many of the restaurants are premium products. That's where our prime beef goes. Do some consumers buy prime beef in the grocery stores? Yes, most don't. Most buy choice. That's a less premium value, so there's less value associated with the production with the grocery stores there. And I think that 30%, getting that back to zero or growing again, is going to take some time to get there. Third thing about this industry structural shift that I'll say is that we learned a lot about how we have two separate food markets, that food away from home market and our grocery store market, and the supply chains for them are separated. It took us 3 weeks to figure out how to get eggs into the grocery store when we had plenty of eggs, but they were packaged for restaurants. You can't put those packages in a grocery store. It doesn't work that way, right? We've figured out that those sort of supply chains aren't very flexible, aren't capable to move easily. Same thing in the fresh fruit and vegetable industry. If you were restaurant or institutional demand, if that's who you supplied to as a lettuce producer, moving that lettuce to the grocery store can't do that. It doesn't just happen by flipping a switch. They're going to be looking at, we are going to be looking at in this industry, how do we change that? How do we make those systems more flexible? That's likely to come with more regulation and probably more cost associated with it as we try to think about how do we allow that switch to happen more quickly. The U.S. meat industry example, I don't need to spend much time with you on this. This was pretty amazing to see what that shock can do for a supply chain, right? So at the time we had the COVID virus really starting to hit our meat packing industry, we had tremendous constraints on our capacity to kill animals, and we also happened to have a very large surplus of livestock at exactly the same time. That created livestock price plummets. At the same time, meat prices are going up. The bottleneck is in the middle. It's all about the value or cost of shackle space at that point. Shackle space is limited. It's going to be the one that gets the price, and that price is low prices for cattle, high prices for meat, paying for the shackle space. That's the constraint, right? And we saw that happen pretty dramatically particularly in the beef and pork industries, not so much in the poultry industry. And so what we ended up with was a mix of these higher prices, but we also ended up with altered product offerings. I don't know if you went to the grocery store, but there are certain cuts of meat you just couldn't get them. They didn't exist anymore. And there were times, at least in my market here, I live in Monticello, Indiana, I could go in and get a cut of meat I could have never gotten before. I mean, a whole quarter of beef. I could get a quarter of beef, but I couldn't get any special cuts out of it because that didn't exist anymore. You had to buy the whole thing. Kind of amazing. to see how some of that happened. And then, of course, rationing of purchasing was also happening. Couldn't buy, in some places in the country, couldn't buy more than 3 pounds of hamburger meat at a time. I don't know if what you're supposed to do if you have a family of 7. 3 pounds of hamburger meat's not going to get you by, but you couldn't do it, right? I guess you bring all your kids to the grocery store, which is great for that social distancing activity, and have each one of them buy 3 pounds of hamburger meat, right? So what we learned from this, though, was that there's a high vulnerability where labor is most involved. It's interesting because despite the fact we had mass layoffs in several industries all around the country, the meat processing sector could not get enough people to work. Couldn't get them to work because they were sick, couldn't get them to work because they were afraid they were going to get sick. This was a major problem for them, really incredible. So what do we think might happen here? I think we're going to see some potential to think about structural changes in that meat industry. We're going to increase automation. I think, we've been talking about automation in the meat industry for a long time. Labor has been relatively cheap, so they've been able to do that. But as we've ramped up our immigration policies, reduced our immigration, labor was already starting to come up in cost. Now we see this additional cost of what happens to humans in this sort of situation. I think there's increasing pressure now to start thinking about how we're going to do more to automate and we're already seeing this in some of our meat packing industries. We're probably likely going to see additional storage capacity as well. And as you think about that from a market's perspective, what does that mean for us? If we have more additional storage capacity, that changes sort of the seasonality of markets and the way those prices are going to adjust over time. So we'll have to be prepared for those things happening that shift in that supply chain. Last big driver change is employment shifts. Just a couple of things I want to point out on unemployment. One is, I'll just show you the chart real quick. This is the chart of economic textbooks for 2020, 2021 and beyond. We'll be talking about these sorts of things like this spike in unemployment that happened here at the end of 2020. Sorry, you can't see that very well, but that's March. The spike is March. April is March was mid, the peak is April and May, and then we have June back to about 11.1% unemployment rate, right? In our history, I'm sorry you can't see this very well, but this is 1945 all the way up through 2020, and each of the gray areas are our recessions that we had. Nowhere have we seen that kind of an unemployment spike. This is what you call a true black swan event. Something you just simply can't prepare for, right? And so we're now sitting at, in June, we're sitting at an unemployment rate that's as high as we've ever seen. And of course, it was the highest ever in April. Highest ever unemployment rate since we've been keeping since 1945 that we've seen since World War II. So that's a pretty dramatic unemployment. And it happened practically overnight, right? So a couple things that I would say about that. One is it remains to be seen exactly how we recover from this. We're adding jobs back. Well, we also had an increase in unemployment claims just this month. It seemed to be washing each other out, but we're flattening. We're not really continuing to increase those jobs back and get this unemployment down. It looks like that may be flattening. How long will it be like this? In that process, we've had enormous increases in the generosity of the welfare state. And we see this happening now, and we're having these tough debates about what do we do with unemployment insurance, for example. Are we creating the wrong incentives? People don't want to go back to work. How do we adjust that system? Today, I think I read something about, well, we're going to go to a 70% replacement of your income. Okay, that might be helpful. I don't know about you, but I'm not a farmer anymore because I don't like for my income in 1 year to be adjusted by 30%. Farmers, all the farmers on here, you're all used to that. Your income goes up and down all the time, but most of us soft people are used to our salary being the same every year. Boy, a 30% increase, a 30% cut would be tough, right? So we've got this very large increase in the generosity of the welfare state. How long can they do that? I mean, how long will this pandemic go, and how long can they continue to do it? It's the reason we're already having a debate. We got to lower the $600 a month premium down to something different than that. How much more money can we spend? We're already thinking about those sorts of issues, and yet the virus has not gone away, and we're not seeing all those jobs come back. And it's a pretty difficult situation, I think. One of the things that I do think is that our industry typically, in general, is hiring, right? Our industry is still moving. It's still doing what it needs to be doing, so it's still hiring. There a couple of things that might be positive from that perspective in a bad situation. One is wages are likely to come down. Now, we have 20 million people all of a sudden looking for jobs. The wages will likely decline, to at least to some degree on the high end. The second thing is that there's going to be skilled workers and that are looking for jobs. And for those of us who've been trying to hire people into skilled positions, we know that's been quite difficult to do for the last several years. This is an opportunity where you may be able to bring talent into your organization that you couldn't get before because there's more of it available to us. The other thing that I would point out about that is I do think this has implications for us, at least as our current administration looks at it with respect to immigration. And for those of us in our operations who rely heavily on migrant workers, this can be a big challenge. When we have large unemployment in the U.S., there's more pressure to hold out people from the outside coming in under the guise that we need those jobs for our people. Those of us in this industry know, yeah, well, our people won't do those jobs. So I just don't see somebody, frankly, I don't see somebody losing their job in a restaurant who's going to go milk cows. I just don't. I mean, that assumes some sort of level of labor mobility that doesn't exist. And it just doesn't exist. They will stay on unemployment rather than go milk cows. I think we have to be careful about that, but that's likely where we're headed right now, is with this kind of unemployment, we're going to make immigration and migrant worker movements even more difficult, not less difficult, for sure. And I think we got to be prepared for that in our industries that rely heavily on those migrant workers. The last thing I'll say about this is the social side of this. I don't know about you, but I've been observing this, and I don't have a solution for it, but I'm concerned about it. This unemployment issue is especially problematic for lower educated workers. And they're the ones who lost their jobs here. The people who could least afford to lose their jobs are the ones who lost their jobs. That's really quite difficult to deal with. And those that haven't lost their jobs are the ones that we have decided are, what do we call it now? I can't think of the word. Essential. They're essential. Who's essential? A person working in Walmart. A person who delivers groceries to your house. It's, generally speaking, the poor and the uneducated either lost their jobs or they're the ones who have to be out on the front line saying you need to risk your life so that the rest of us don't have to. That's a tough situation to be in. I think a tough situation. Now, I don't want to make this into a political argument. I want to be careful about this, but it's part of the social unrest thing we got going on out here. Yeah, there's lots of reasons for around the racism issues and all that sort of stuff and the things that happen there. But one of the reasons for the social unrest is we have a society where the haves aren't having to suffer nearly as much as the have-nots are here. And there's a reason why you get this sort of overall unrest in the society. And I think this is part of it. COVID has sort of laid this bare, right? That there's a certain set of society that's supposed to do that service work, that essential work, that hard work, that less paid work, but they're expected to do that. And it's been laid bare, I think, and creates a tremendous amount of stress on society. Okay, so let me, silver linings quickly. Hey, I gave you the one of them already. My 89-year-old grandma FaceTime me every week. She wouldn't do that before. No idea about FaceTime or what that's supposed to do. She FaceTimes everybody now, right? I never know. She probably FaceTime me before we get done here, right? She's FaceTiming all the time. It's amazing. It's been amazing to me to watch how agriculture has gotten so connected digitally. Look what we're doing. Steve, we would not have even remotely considered this as a possibility a year ago. We'd say, oh, no, that's never going to work. Look what we're doing. I mean, we are really finding ways to be, in some ways, I think, better managed organizations. We have more flexible workforces. We've proved that on most occasions, I think we've proved in our businesses that our people want to do well for our companies. And they're effective and efficient, even from home in environments that are not necessarily conducive to that. They've figured out how to do that. And as companies, we've moved practically on a dime to make it happen. I mean, Purdue was incredible. I was traveling the week before spring break, and on my way back on Thursday, I got notification that when they come back from spring break, they won't come back. We'll be teaching online. And in 1 week, just like that, we did it. Now, did we do it great? No, we didn't do it great, but we did it. We made it happen. And I think we can say that about a lot of our organizations. Maybe we didn't do things great, but we did it. We've made it happen. We've figured it out. We've been creative. What is it that they say about necessity is the mother of invention? We've figured out, we've invented ways to figure out how to make things happen, and we've done fairly well with those sort of things. I think that's really kind of fascinating. And it's sort of forcing us to have a pace and scale of innovation that's probably higher than we've ever seen before in our society as a whole. And so I think those are really good things for us to think about, that you know, in the face of a terrible situation, a place none of us want to be, that we're showing some resiliency as a human race to figure out what we're going to do. Yeah, we're going through some difficult times here in the U.S. right now. We've got fits and starts, haven't quite figured it all out. But there's been some pretty amazing things that have happened during this time period too, and I don't want us to get too bogged down and that's all doom and gloom. Right? So that, I got another poll question for you real quick, Rachel, if you don't mind. I want to ask you about those 8 drivers. Which ones of these 8 drivers do you think is the one that's most important for us to be thinking about in production agriculture? So these are the 8 that I talked to you about. Which one's the most important ones? Not which is the most important one. I'm asking you to say, which one of these do you think has the most impact on us in agriculture over the next 2 years? While you're answering this particular question, don't forget that there is the chat available out there. If you got questions, don't hesitate to put them out there. Questions, comments, whatever you want to do, feel free to do that.
Final call. We're at 75% participation, 77%, 78%. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Okay. Good, interesting. I had suspected deglobalization might be a part of that. Of course, in our big commodities markets, we got to worry about where we're going with this global demand. Is China going to do what they said they would do? And are they going to continue to have growing demand even in general? I think that's certainly something we've got to worry about. And are we going to continue to fight with them and with others for that matter? So I think that's critically important. I find it interesting that we had so many that picked resiliency versus efficiency, because we are facing this problem right now. And it's the thing to me. I'm encouraged to see you say that in the sense that you appreciate maybe what I told you to begin with, which is I don't have any answers, because all I've got on the resiliency versus efficiency is really questions, because there's no clear answers yet exactly what that's going to look like. But we've got a lot to think about in terms of how we maintain that resiliency in our markets. So let me move ahead just quickly here. Some things that I think are important strategies for us to think about, and these are broad strategies. I talk to a lot of agribusinesses, not just to farmers, to agribusinesses all around, and I talk about a number of different things that I think are important for us as we think about resilience, responsiveness, and resourcefulness as the ways we need to think about our strategies for our companies moving forward. And these are some specific things I think we ought to think about. One is a startup mindset. I think we're in a position now where we're in such an uncertain environment that we have to think like a startup would think, right? A startup is always in an uncertain environment. What does that mean? It means it favors taking action over research and testing over analysis, right? But we don't want to be in a situation like we're in now, where we're analyzing, and not making decisions, because you can analyze forever. You're not going to come up with an answer, right? We need to take action rather than just do research, because we're not going to learn by sitting and waiting, right? So we've got to be able to think about ways that we take action and do some testing to figure out what's going to work for us and what's not going to work for us. Right? And I think we can think about that in all kinds of businesses, even in farming, right? I would tell you that, if I'm in the commodity corn and soybean business, I am focused on two things. Number one, what kind of things can I do that improve my productivity? That's the number one thing I got to do, right? And here's the thing about that improvement in productivity is right now, you need to be producing at about 10% over the average. Your yields need to be 10% higher than the average for you to be able to break even. And the thing is, you can't do one thing better and get 10%. You're probably going to have to do 100 things, 1% better to get to your 10%. That means taking action. So that's in the commodity side of the market. Second thing is, if I don't feel like I'm good enough to be able to do that, I got to start thinking about alternatives. I got to start thinking about other things I can do, new markets I can create. So if I can't do it on an efficiency and a cost basis, I got to start thinking of it in terms of value creation perspective. What kinds of things could I do differently to add more value? What to the acres that I'm farming or to the animals that I'm feeding? What can I do that would add more value to that marketplace? So I think that's places where we think about a startup mindset. How do we think about that? Second thing is it's human at the core. There's lots of reasons to believe that we're going to automate, that we're going to digitize, that we're going to create all of these sorts of inhuman interactions like we have here. This is sort of a human interaction, but in a digital way. There's lots of that's going to happen, but we should remember that still this is a people business. It's going to be a people business. We're going to be engaged with each other. We just may engage in some different ways. And what we want to think about is how are we adjusting our operating models to make sure that our people are able to work at their best? Somebody asked me in a presentation I was making yesterday about this. What do you think about office space, Alan, working at home versus working in the office in the future? And I said, well, two things. One, I'm not all that interested in investing in construction companies that are going to build great big office buildings with cubicle setups. I think that's not going to be here for much longer. We're probably going to move away from that. Second thing is, I believe that the genie's out of the bottle. We have proved we can work from home. And the companies who are going to resist that are going to start saying, are going to have a hard time resisting it because the genie's out of the bottle. They've already shown that they can do that. And employees are going to demand some flexibility with the ability to do that. So I think that's going to happen to us. The third thing that I think we ought to be careful of with respect to that as a human at the core, though, is that humans, by their very nature, still need interaction. And that interaction that creates longer-term value creation, innovation, usually occurs with interaction. We do have digital tools that can help us do that, but I still believe that there are times where people sitting at a table talking about a problem and somebody getting up and starting to write on a whiteboard are going to be crucially important to creating real value in the future, and we're going to need to do that. And I see that that's what I mean by this human at the core. How do we think about our operating models that allow all these things to happen? That we don't all need to be in cubicles 8 hours a day. That we can work from home and be efficient and effective, but that we do need to find ways to get together and create new. And that those things often mean that we need to be together. Third thing is acceleration of digital tech and analytics. That's not new, but now it's even more crucially important because everything has become so digitized so quickly that those that can figure out how to utilize that digital information faster are going to be better. They're going to be more resilient. They're going to be more effective. They're going to be better positioned. Whether we're talking about those serving production agriculture or those in production agriculture. If you want, for example, to do my 100 things 1% better so that you can get that 10% increase, you're going to have to do it through digital tech and analytics. That's going to help you get to that level. Fourth thing is this purpose-driven customer playbook. How do we think about exactly what our customers want post-COVID-19? They want more organic? Yep, it sure looks like it right now. Are they going to stay that way? I don't know. But they're worried about their health. Now, I'm not telling you that, don't misquote me. I'm not That's not me. I'm not organic is healthier. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all myself, but the consumer generally does. That's the reality. And now that they're worried about their health more, they think more about things like organic. Okay, as an industry, we have to start thinking, what is this customer going to be wanting post COVID-19? What does that mean for us in terms of our ability to create for them that new value, those tailored experiences, and those things are going to happen, I think, in a more rapid way now that we've moved to these sort of digital ways of doing things. Finally, I think our ecosystems and our adaptability is something that we got to think about in our strategies, and most particularly, I think we've figured out in this environment that we can't do things alone, right? The mantra today is we're all in this together. I think we're pushing heavily, even in business now, to say we're going to have to think about collaboration, partnerships, and even some non-traditional partnerships with people to begin to think more carefully about what we're doing in the future and how we're going to be able to survive. We're going to have to do it together. We're going to have to find ways to partner. It's a set of skills that a lot of us don't have, right? We're sort of independent thinkers. We're independent people. We do things on our own. Hey, you know what? I'm just going to pick myself up by my bootstraps. I'm going to make it happen. And in the environment of the future, I think that's not likely to be a very successful strategy. The successful strategy is for those people who figure out how to partner, how to work with people, both on their side of the aisle and the other side of the aisle, both in upstream supply chains and downstream supply chains, that we start to think about how we partner together. This is an ecosystem we work in. It's not the individuals just doing their own thing. This COVID has really raised the awareness on that. So those are my comments for you to think a little bit about in terms of drivers and strategies. I know we're running short on time. I apologize for that. For some reason, when I talk to this audience, I get a little more passionate than I do some of the others. So, but if there are some questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
Well, thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Gray. That's been very insightful, and we do have a few questions. Just want to give a little update from Mike Caney. We thought we had some technical difficulties early on when we was trying to get him on, but actually he had us on hold because Congressman Greg Pence is calling him to ask him a question about an important bill that he was looking at. So I think that just speaks volumes to the access that we can provide Indiana corn and soybean farmers. And I'm glad he did take that call. Thanks again to Mike Beard for jumping in and covering for him. So Rachel, let's get to the questions.
Yeah, Dr. Gray, do you want me to launch your third poll while I take that first question?
Oh yeah, shoot, I forgot about that. We did have a third poll here about which ones of these strategies. So we talked about which ones were the drivers of change you thought were most important for us. This is the question that says, which one of these strategies, these sort of generic strategies I'm talking about, do you think is going to be most important for your business to embrace in this sort of new normal?
And while we're getting answers, first question that we got, will broadband service and connectivity at the farm be as important for farm resilience as we believe it is for farm and farmer efficiency?
Yes, I think one of the things that COVID did too, and I should have put that in here as it relates to this whole digital tech, is I think it's raised awareness of the haves and the have-nots with respect to broadband. And here's what I tell you, I don't think, and y'all can correct me, I actually don't think this is a farmer problem. And many farmers have sort of figured this out. And in your business, you've made an investment to make this happen. I can't tell you how many farmer cooperative boards I've been in since the 1st of March, and they're all online and on Zoom, and they're able to do this. They're able to make this happen. That connectivity is happening. They've made some investments there. And and that's not to say we don't need it. We need more investment overall there. And to me, it's much like a utility sort of a situation, right? Like when we had the rural cooperatives come in with electricity. I mean, it's a similar kind of a thing. This is sort of a broad thing that needs to happen. But I don't think farmers were going to I don't think the farming community was actually going to get it done. I don't think it was going to happen because of that. Now, our rural schools can't get their stuff done. Students can't go to class. People can't get their information they need. That's what has awoken the rest of policymakers to say, hey, wait a minute. This is not just a farm issue. This is a rural issue. This is a set of the people in this country who can't connect, who can't get things done in a world that we live in right now that's got to get fixed. And I think we have the best chance we've ever had of getting that done now, that we have the awareness raised, and it's more constituency basis than just agriculture needs broadband. I was worried whether we'd get there that way, but now we have sort of a coalition that clearly shows rural's in trouble.
I shared your poll results, and another question that we got, can you speak to the possibility of negative growth in 2021?
Possibility of negative growth in 2021.
I think that was a reference back to your first set of graphs.
Yeah, sort of the U shape and the L shape. The U shape would be positive. L shape would probably be negative for a fair amount of 2021 anyway. You know, my view of it, for what it's worth, is that I have this optimism that on two fronts, this pandemic is going to slow down for us. We're gonna have treatments that'll treat it better, and I actually think that's going to happen well before a vaccine. I think doctors are learning how to manage this disease better, and the drugs that we're getting, and they get approved much faster than the vaccines themselves. That's going to happen first. I think we're going to be able to treat it better. I think that might happen by late fall, early winter. And then the second thing is the vaccine's going to come, and the vaccines will come, and I think they'll come out after the first of the year, into the early spring. And as those things come back, I think that's what keeps us on a trajectory that we might see growth in 21. So then they ask, what's the situation where we get negative growth in 21? Those things don't happen. The vaccine's not effective, and this virus keeps mutating in a way that our drugs can't keep up with it. And the issue is I have no clue about those things, right? But I feel like we've got so much resources. I'm talking about not just money. I'm talking about brain resources, collaborating around the world to find a solution to this problem, that we're going to find a solution. I personally don't believe we'll get rid of this one for a very long time, but we'll be able to treat it, and we'll be able to vaccinate for it, and that'll allow us to manage it better, right? And so when we can manage it better, I think the economy will grow. If we can't manage it better, then we clearly have an opportunity for negative growth in 2021. I would like to not even have to think about that, because I think you're going to look back on 2020 and say, man, this is one of the worst we've ever seen. And it is going to be. I hate to see that go into 2021. So I'm a strategy person who's famous for telling people hope is not a strategy. And I think the answer I just gave you was that hope is what I have as the strategy for us to not have negative growth in 2021. I have hope.
At this point, we are 8 minutes over, so I'm going to send you the rest of the questions that we've got. We've got questions on the impact of the election, crop tools, a variety of stuff. So we'll have a robust list of questions to send you for follow-up. But I think if you want to go ahead and make a final comment, then we will move into our CEO remarks.
Actually, my quick final comment to everybody is thank you for the opportunity to visit with you. I appreciate the opportunities, because unlike most everybody else, mostly I spend my time stuck in my house trying to figure out how I'm going to teach my brilliant students at Purdue online and on campus at the same time. I don't know how I'm going to do that. That's what I spend most of my time doing. So the opportunity to speak with the group is really, I'm grateful for that. So I appreciate Steve providing that opportunity.
Yeah, so good to have you. It's certainly complicated. We've seen this seismic shift in not just our industry, but across all sectors. So it's something that we can't fully understand yet, but I think we need to keep engaging in this discussion, this type of discussion, so we can better understand what our future is going to look like. So with that, thanks again, Dr. Gray, and we'll turn it over to Courtney Kingery, the CEO of the Soybean Alliance and the Corn Growers Association. Courtney?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And thank you, Dr. Gray, for joining us and sharing your comments with the members and partners of the Indiana Soybean Alliance and Indiana Corn Growers. And I thought I heard you slide in that you're from Monticello. So from one Monticello native to a resident, we appreciate all your comments and your passion and even a little bit of hope there at the end. So we appreciate that. You touched on the 8 drivers of change that are really pushing and pulling around our economy overall, our ag market, and our food supply. And that tied in really well with where Ed started us out, talking about the different trajectory between corn and soybeans and how corn's really a wild card. So we see how all of those fit together. Now, as we're looking forward on this lunch break webinar series in the future, we've got a few coming up. And for those of you, just to make sure everyone knows, July 28th, next Tuesday, we originally had scheduled our policy summit, but that is going to be moving virtual. So we will be taking the topics that were going to be covered in that, and we're moving those to the lunch break webinar series. So you'll be seeing those over the next few sessions. One of the next ones we have coming up is on July 30th at 12 o'clock Eastern Time. Talking with FAS Administrator Ken Isley. We'll also be having representatives from USNEF, U.S. Meat Export Federation, and the USA Poultry and Egg Export Council, specifically discussing around animal proteins. You heard from Dr. Gray that there's just no way really that the domestic home consumption of animals is going to keep up with production and supply when you saw the massive drop off of the retail restaurant sectors. So we see meat exports as a big tool and a big opportunity in that marketplace to continue to move more of that volume through. We're also going to be continuing those into August with our virtual meetings and also our Shop Talk series. So keep an eye out for dates and times of those in your local area for the Shop Talk series. And of course, our big celebration in August for the American Soybean Association 100th anniversary celebration. That's going to be in Camden, celebrating really the leading role that Indiana farmers and Indiana ag had in the growth and development of soybeans and adoption of soybeans for really the nation as a whole. So we've got a whole lot of upcoming events, some of them in person, some of them we're going to be trying to do virtual, so please mark your calendars for all of those. And again, thank you again, Dr. Gray, for joining us today. We'll see everyone next week. I think, Rachel, you've got one more video to close us out. So thank you, everybody. Have a great week and be safe.
What BT traits do is they really serve to protect that yield potential. When you get insects such as corn borers or armyworm or rootworms or things, those insects start to feed on the plant, causing stress, but also robbing that plant of some of the nutrients that it is needing to help try to realize that yield potential. So what BT traits do is they really protect that yield potential that is determined by those other factors.
Thank you, everybody. And one last point, there is going to be one more webinar, a virtual USDA report recap with Purdue. That's going to be live cast from Purdue on August 12th. So if you're able to join us for that, we'd love to have you on that. Keep an eye out for that one. Again, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thanks all.
Thank you.